If your supply chain needs a passport, it's probably too long. In these uncertain times, we experience that with COVID and so on. It can be really difficult to get things around and on time in particular. So what we offer is really a way to avoid those kind of risks associated with your supply chain. And then at the same time, we're not necessarily, we didn't set out to save the planet, we set out to save downtime, but the planet came as a really nice bonus. In the future, factories won't necessarily be big, they'll be everywhere. And so you're not trying to have parts that cross the oceans, they're crossing the street instead. Sustainability without margins is just a really expensive hobby. So you need to find a way to make it work from a business perspective as well, otherwise it doesn't really land. One of the biggest challenges we have in sustainability comes back to this problem of no one really wants to buy climate guilt. You have to sell an operational advantage, and being able to measure an operational advantage in complex systems is very difficult. But with AI it becomes a lot easier, and being able to put an actual price tag to the damages and costs we're doing to our environment, that is hugely powerful, because if you can convince the CFO, the rest of the company follows.
Welcome back to the Plucky Bamboo Podcast, where we get into the real stories and strategies behind scaling sustainability-focused businesses. Today, I'm joined by Espen Sivertsen, founder and CEO of Ivaldi Group, a company transforming how industrial spare parts are made and moved by turning global supply chains into local on-demand manufacturing networks. This episode digs into the hidden barriers that trip up even the most innovative solutions. For example, we talk about why most supply chain teams are structurally incentivized not to innovate and how to work around it, how Espen kept his products focused, scalable, and margin positive in a notoriously slow-moving industry, and what founders need to understand about AI, proprietary data, and selling sustainability without relying on climate guilt. If you're trying to move complex buyers, unlock new markets, or build something that scales without compromise, this one's definitely worth sticking around for. Let's get into it. Hi Espen, thank you very much for joining us today on the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me. So basically I'm the founder, CEO, chief troublemaker at Ivaldi Group. We are a small startup that is focused on digital supply chains. So the idea is you basically send files rather than aftermarket spare parts. And then you 3D print or otherwise on-demand manufacture them locally, thereby saving carbon and you can do repairs and a whole bunch of stuff that you couldn't do effectively before.
So what core problem does Ivaldi solve, and why did you choose to build a company around that specifically?
Yeah, so the backstory is I started off, I got married to an American and ended up in San Francisco in 2010, just as the 3D printing sort of hype wave was taking off. And I ended up starting a company that actually my neighbor had invented, like a new desktop 3D printer. So when we started, we were one of 14 companies in the world building these desktop 3D printers, FDM technologies. The journey we went on was quite wild, but what we realized at the end of that journey was there's a lot of real impact going on right now, and it has been for decades, around on-demand manufacturing. So when we started, we were one of 14 companies in the world. When we shut down in 2016, we were one of 473 companies in the world. And so it was it's the real boom and bust. And what caused us to really start Ivaldi was we were realizing actually these on-demand tools are getting faster, better, cheaper every single year, if not like on a weekly basis. And so the consequence of that is you can sort of change supply chain. And, if you think about what we essentially offer, it's the ability to take what's currently a hardware problem, sending parts around the world, and turning it into a software problem where you keep a digital inventory in the cloud and then you do on-demand manufacture instead. And that has some great benefits. From our perspective, if your supply chain needs a passport, it's probably too long. In these uncertain times, we experienced that with COVID and so on. It can be really difficult to get things around and on time in particular. So what we offer is really a way to avoid those kind of risks associated with your supply chain. And then at the same time, we're not necessarily, we didn't set out to save the planet, we set out to save downtime, but the planet came as a really nice bonus. And what it's enabled us to do is actually, keep equipment longer in production, and we can actually upgrade equipment as well. So, extending life cycles is a really strong way of actually lowering carbon footprint, particularly if you can upgrade the equipment as well. So like being able to take a pump and actually make it more energy efficient over time by essentially installing replacement parts that are better than the original parts, stuff like that. So we work with mining, heavy industry like rail and energy and all kinds of stuff like that. But really, it comes down to being able to send files, not parts, around the world and helping companies adopt those kind of more modern supply chain practices.
Yeah, it's a shame it wasn't, this technology and this way of working wasn't fully built out when COVID hit and afterwards, because the supply chain, from what I understand, I'm not an expert, but I know a lot of the inflation that was caused by supply chains no longer being sort of on-time
Yeah.
supply.
Yeah, I mean, so you
Yeah.
had like literally 50% of the world's air traffic getting grounded because it was passenger planes, people weren't flying, and 50% of the world's air cargo was using passenger planes. So, it just really caused a lot of issues, as everyone knows.
Oh yeah,
But
I think
that's,
everyone's got it.
yeah. But at the same time, like I remember being on the ground at the time I was visiting my family in Norway. On the Friday, we got the first request in from California, where we have our headquarters, around being able to print PPE gear, personal protective equipment. And we weren't the only people in the 3D printing space doing it, but like overnight, we went from having, I think we got the first request in Friday afternoon, like 3 p.m. Norway time. By 5 p.m., we'd printed the first prototype, and the next morning already we were in mass production in California, printing protective face shields and all that stuff. So it really goes to show that, if you have that kind of on-demand capability, a crisis can be, in many ways, a booster as well. Like a lot of our customers shut down at the same time, but it opened up some new opportunities for us.
How was it you got those first few clients then?
The first thing that we did was actually put on sort of like our Viking Mafia helmets, and we went and knocked on some doors in Norway. Being a small country, I'm originally from Norway, we sort of tapped into that. So we had a strong network in the maritime industry through one of our investors, and so we were able to actually get the world's largest ship service agency on board very early, and that then gave us access to all of their sort of data and insights, and also a huge sort of booster in terms of trying to develop a product, and a big part of it for sustainability is, if you, and for any product really, is like if you don't have a real customer from day one that you're working with that has real need, it's harder to build something that fits, right? And even then it's hard. You got to start somewhere, and for us that was a real booster.
Can you walk me through one of the, I guess, the hard-earned lessons that you might have had from the early days? Maybe something that looked really simple but turned out to be a real challenge for you.
Yeah, I mean, like the biggest thing that's still hard is just the sort of, I guess the word I'm looking for is sort of like the just how stuck current supply chain is. So if you think about it, so when I started out with Ivaldi Group, I was like, oh, heavy industry, their software was built in the 80s. This is a blue ocean for us, we're gonna kill it here. And now, 8 years later, it's like, oh, there's a reason their software was built then. And the reason is, everyone in supply chain's job is to de-risk supply chain. And so anything new is a risk. And so if you're in, like, supply chain is really important for sustainability, right? I mean, if you look at the statistics in terms of like world carbon, everything is connected into supply chain. From, how do we operate power plants to how do we get the clothes on our back. And the problem with the sort of carbon footprint today is, if you're trying to create something new for supply chain, then you're up against this risk aversion. And so everyone wants to be like a fast follower. They want you to have proved it already with some customer. And then it's like sort of de-risk. If you've got a whole bunch of customers under your belt, and you can show the value prop and the savings and so on. But getting that going in the first place can be really hard, particularly if it's a new product, because no one gets paid extra for like innovating in supply chain. That's not, there are very few people whose job that isn't. Typically they are so high up in the system that when you then get put in touch with procurement or operations or whatever, like their KPIs, the things that they're getting measured on isn't new stuff. It's just my keeping things running. And so one of the big things that we actually ended up having to work with was how do we get leadership to help set the stage and sort of open up the possibility of even trying something new. And then throughout the supply chain stack, with every single personality involved, the persona, however you want to structure it, how are you able to then make their job easier by switching to something new? Like you got to de-risk it for them. You've got to actually integrate with their workflow in a way that makes their life easier. And any friction that you create anywhere in that stack is going to probably scupper your project. So it's a real important element. Like how can you get adoption in a system that's designed to not try new things?
Obviously, they care about risk aversion, but with so many risks happening now internationally, is it about weighing the risks? So weighing the risk of trying something new versus weighing against the known risks that are going to happen because they happened during COVID, supply chain shut down. There are now trade issues happening.
Yeah.
So is that something you've looked at? Is it something that works? Am I completely off base?
No, I mean, look, every time a supply chain breaks, it's a critique of globalization. So like we've spent a century optimizing for efficiency. And globally, and even during COVID, okay, we had like toilet paper shortage in the US, and people lost their mind or their shit. But like, it's been surprisingly resilient, even in the face of everything going on. So, it works. The problem is that we've spent a century at this point optimizing for efficiencies and sort of cost savings, and now we're paying for it in fragility. And so when we're looking at kind of how do you create like a new type of thing. The challenge now, as I see it, is, well, we can't go back to what we used to do. Although a lot of companies are choosing to do that, which is, more just in case. And so you have sort of just in time inventory versus just in case inventory. And then just in case, you basically just stock everything. So now you have lots of basically carry on your books. That's really bad for the environment because a lot of those spare parts never get used. And, from a financial point of view as well. And then you just have just in time, right, which is what we've been optimizing for the last century, essentially, which is, you get exactly what you need when and where you need it, using a incredibly complex global supply chain. It depends a little bit on, what types of parts and so on. But without going into it too much, China's emerged as this like powerhouse when it comes to being able to deliver on that kind of model. Because they can mass manufacture very cost effectively in China. And we're at the point now, by the way, where, it's not just cost, it's actually quality is better in China than everywhere else. So, but what's happening now is, okay, you've got a lot of risks, right? You've got things like people misplacing their boat in the Suez Canal, and you've got COVID shutting down air transport. You've got the Taiwan Strait and the situation in Taiwan that can totally cause trouble for a lot of people who are very dependent on China right now. And so by turning this huge problem into essentially a software and local manufacturing problem, where you're not trying to offset the broken supply chain, you're redesigning it as you get companies to adopt those things. By the way, the easiest way to start is like with less critical systems, right? And then you can sort of build trust over time. But what we're doing is we're basically creating a future where we're not trying to, in Europe right now, there's a lot of talk about bringing manufacturing back to Europe. But from our perspective, we're not trying to create these big giga factories. I'm sure there'll be some of those as well. But in the future, factories won't necessarily be big. They'll be everywhere. And so you're not trying to have parts that cross the oceans. They're crossing the street instead. And this is really like the key, right? Is when you're trying to create some sort of new adoption, these crises are real potential momentum elements. And if you look at the way sort of the mindset works in supply chains, procurement teams are basically measured on being able to save cents to the dollar. And so, how do you do that? Well, if you create a bulk purchase, now you have some leverage so you can get, margins down and so on. And everyone's happy with that. The challenge with that is now you have a whole bunch of like just in case inventory. And from a total cost perspective from the company, that's actually really bad business a lot of the time because you don't use all the goods. And Now you have a central storage and warehousing costs and all that stuff. But if you go from just in time or just in case to just online inventory, now you have a digital inventory and you have a distributed network of manufacturers that you can connect into. And as volumes go up, you can actually bring costs down on that as well. And that gives you a whole third option in supply chain that we believe is, and starting to show in numbers as well, can give you a lot of savings. So, there are cases coming out of the industry now where people have saved like $30 million in a year just on avoiding downtime using these kinds of systems, or being able to reduce inventory costs by several $1 million by not having things on your books that you would otherwise have to because of long lead times or just the risk associated with not having access to the parts.
It sounds like how almost like Amazon has built warehouses everywhere and holding inventory at the warehouses in different cities to get the actual delivery through quickly.
Yeah.
It sounds like in the future, what that could be is, instead of warehouses, we have manufacturing plants, small facilities where things are created there and then shipped to people's homes. I mean, who knows, in 100 years, it could be everyone has a 3D printer at home. But
so we looked at that, but the thing with having a 3D printer at home is now you have to maintain it and operate it. And
yeah.
You know how 2D printers are, right? Like if you've ever used one, you know how infuriating that can be. 3D printers are 2D printers with an extra dimension. So it's not necessarily like a solution. And yeah, maybe sometime in the distant future we'll get the Star Trek replicator that everyone wants, and you can go like tea Earl Grey hot and you just get it. But we're not anywhere close to that. And so, we think that there are already local manufacturers. They exist. The challenge that they have right now is their volume is really low. So they're primarily used for prototyping and sort of like one-off situations where the cost of the part doesn't really matter. But if you take those same manufacturers and you give them enough volume within the category of part, now they don't necessarily have to charge you like 600 setup costs and all those things because they've got that throughput. So it's mass manufacturing of custom parts locally, right? So you don't necessarily know every single component. Like, so just use pumps as an example, right? So like we have one of our customers on the African continent. They spend about $7 million on pumps every year, which is just a huge amount of money. And actually, it's not just pumps, it's just specifically impellers as a component in the pump. So $7 million on that. They have a quite wide range of impellers, but if you can sort of box that into a manageable manufacturing order and then do throughput, even though you don't know the exact design, but you know what materials and what equipment, and you have the overall sort of restrictions, now you can actually feed local manufacturers with much more throughput, and that brings costs down and the ability to do things in a way more sustainable way as well. Because right now, you're paying for it in carbon footprint, both in storage and shipping things and all that stuff. But if you can manufacture it locally, or better yet, refurbish existing parts locally, which is also something that we've done, now your carbon footprint looks very different. But it's like sustainability without margins is just a really expensive hobby. So you need to find a way to make it work from a business perspective as well. Otherwise, it doesn't really land with the customers or with the people supplying the customers.
What's been your scrappiest growth win so far? Something that you pulled off with zero budget that actually worked for you?
There's a lot of those. The thing that sort of springs to mind right now, because we just did the press release on it, is we've now joined forces with a company called Med3 Druk in Ukraine, and they provide prosthetics, 3D printed prosthetics and assisted living solutions for people who've lost limbs during the war, basically. And what we've been able to do now is our system is at the point now where we can help them essentially get this sort of digital supply chain into their space as well. They've already been doing volunteer work, but we can now work with them to kind of get that to the next level to help the tens of thousands of people who've lost limbs. It didn't cost us anything because we already built something for heavy industry that we can now apply to all these other spaces as well. And I think that's a really important aspect of scaling, right? Is if you can keep a core focus on the product in such a way that it can be applied to a number of places without you necessarily having to spend like a gazillion hours trying to customize it for each space, then that scales a lot better. And then we've got wins like we're the first company in the world to get actually commercially 3D printed parts on vessels, in like a business way. We've been the first company in the world to get like a commercial offering into the mining space. So we've done a whole bunch of things that didn't necessarily cost us a lot of money to do, in part because we partnered with the right people very early on, and that's given us a lot of momentum.
I think there's two really important lessons there. The first one is partnering with people. I think the more that businesses collaborate, the more that they work together, the quicker they can both grow. But I think the other one really important there is about product and how you scale. I've seen many founders get into the trap of thinking, we've hit our addressable market with this product now, let's build another product and put that out to market. And actually what ends up happening is you increase your complexity by 2 to 3 times with the same number of team, the same amount of resources, and both products end up doing much worse. I think you've got a really key thing there in saying, move the product sideways to another market that would actually be able to use it. And it's a much easier way to scale than it is to change or create an entire product.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like, look, I mean, it's not been an easy ride for us either. We had to figure out what our product was in the first place, right? So like when we first pitched our main investor and collaborator Wilhelmsen on the maritime side, we really only had 3 slides. It was like 3D printing is getting faster, better, cheaper. This is going to have consequences for your supply chain. We have no idea really, but let's figure it out together. So 3 slides, they gave us, $3 million, and we were off to the races. So it's a good ratio slide by slide to get started with. But the challenge is, I think, in those situations is you have a good idea when you set out what it is that you want to do, but you don't really know how it's going to implement, particularly we're doing B2B, right? So with large, complex enterprises and in sort of tractionless systems like supply chain, where risk is a really big challenge, and where you have the other big thing with big companies, of course, is sales cycles are really long. So you're looking at 12 to 18 months sales cycles. And in a 12 to 18 month sales cycle, where, things also take time to implement, figuring out the exact fit and like what works and all that stuff, that's really hard. Because try remembering what you did 12 months ago, right? Fast forward another 18 months of implementation. It's like, okay, what is the product? What did we end up doing? How did we do these things? So one of the things that's actually helped us quite a lot now in more recent years is miniaturizing sort of those steps, so that we've now created like really low entry, low barrier product offerings that are part of the core focus, but sort of like step into it. And that way we've shortened our sales cycles. We're able to bring in a lot more focus on that sort of like onboarding experience as well, and identifying much more rapidly what's the real value here for each stakeholder in the supply chain that you're working with, and how do you make their job and life easier. And to your point, it's already really complex and difficult and hard to run a startup. Trying to run multiple products to like multiple different settings, and particularly in the B2B space, where like really each large customer can very easily end up requiring their own type of product. Staying focused on that core, it's really hard. But the benefit of doing it, we're finding now, is over time that core has become really, really solid. And so there's a core center of competency and data and solutions that I think is going to be very hard for others to go in and replicate. And that gives us that sort of like, engine for building momentum now forwards as well.
What's a big bet that you're making over the next 12 months that might work or might not work?
Well, I mean, it's all about AI at the moment, right? So, at the risk of being yet another voice in the storm that's hitting, I do think we've been playing with it. So, like we started playing with this a couple of years ago, because actually a big part of the value prop that we found was for owner operators, they don't really have a lot of insight into their own spare parts data, because they don't have a lot of data. Being able to contextualize that data and add a much richer data landscape to very limited inputs has been one of the things that we've been working on quite hard for a while. And of course, with LLMs and agentic systems and MCPs and all these things that are coming out now, it's enabling us to sort of take that to a whole different level. But then the big challenge and the big bet is, how do you create a company that can actually develop and grow in a world where intelligence is on this trajectory to become a utility? So like, basically already we have in our pockets this amazing tool. I'm using it, multiple times a day through ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or whatever tool you're using. That's enabling us to basically have really valuable answers just using that app. And so, we've been coding using AI as well. So like being able to now go in, just clone whatever software you need or build your own version of it. That's really powerful. It's the worst it's ever going to be right now. So this is the challenge, right? And the big bet for us is we are betting that those systems, as they get better, will not be able to do the things that we are focusing on around contextualization because that data isn't on the internet. And in fact, doesn't exist on the internet. And so the big bet is, that data doesn't exist on the internet and won't in the future. And if that's true, then we will have a really valuable proposition because we're essentially building a bridge in two ways. So one is with our solution, we're building a bridge from the current physical world into the digital world. And we're doing that in two ways. One is through our context engine that's creating that more rich data landscape and connecting the dots in ways that are hard for agentic or LLM systems to do, or whatever AI you're looking at. And then the other thing is we're building a bridge from the digital world back into the physical world through on-demand manufacturing. So for Ivaldi with on-demand manufacturing and what we're calling capture, which is the sort of like input from the physical world into the digital world, we're trying to build an engine that can create that context and enable these systems. Sorry, I geek out on this. So I won't spend too much more time on it, but that's the big bet that we're making for the future.
Very, very quickly on that. Being in marketing for so long, there was a time when knowledge was valuable, data was valuable. So people would be creating white papers and things like that. And now that we have ChatGPT, that's no longer the case. The only data that is valuable is proprietary data that only you have as a company or another company has. And that's where research comes in. I think now we're starting to see more and more that the value is coming through almost like thought leadership, insightful content, things like that, as opposed to just data and knowledge. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This is the worst that AI will ever be. And I think everyone sees that they have to start bringing AI into their company if they want to stay even with the pack, let alone get ahead.
Go on. Sorry.
So go ahead.
Yeah, no, but you're absolutely right, Chris. It's that combination of human power plus AI, right? And I have programmer friends that work at Microsoft and Google and all the big companies. And what we're seeing is, and in startups as well, the people who are embracing this and getting that like 10x productivity hit, they're charging ahead in their careers right now. And that is the difference between, I think, who's going to win and who's going to lose in this wonderful new world of ours, because it's this adapt or die Darwinism of new technologies coming in and totally disrupting everything. And, my big hope for sustainability is that the companies working and operating within the realm of sustainability will get a real boost from this. Because one of the biggest challenges we have in the space of sustainability comes back to this problem of no one really wants to buy climate guilt. You have to sell an operational advantage. And being able to measure an operational advantage in complex systems is very difficult. But with AI, it becomes a lot easier. And being able to put an actual price tag to the damages and costs we're doing to our environment, that is hugely powerful. Because if you can convince the CFO, the rest of the company follows. So it really comes down to brass tacks. And with AI and some of these new systems coming in, I think it could be hugely beneficial. But we have to adapt or die.
I'm curious, what is one of the biggest mindset shifts that have helped you grow faster as a founder?
For me, it's been one of the things where understanding timing has been hugely important, because I'm sort of a possibilist at heart, right? So I love to see opportunities and possibilities. And the problem with that is you tend to be quite optimistic when it comes to timeframes as well. And our company started 8 years ago. Like we were at the time, I was like, we're going to have a tipping point within the next 2 years when it comes to cost. And 8 years later, it's like, it's not there yet, right? So and you have to actually like work for it. And so the mindset shift for me probably came 2 years ago when I started looking back, and I realized that my own way of thinking was flawed when it comes to timing. That And I think that's a valuable lesson for, because everyone's different, right? All founders are different. We have a couple of sort of common traits. My uncle's a founder as well. Like he described himself as fundamentally unemployable, which I quite liked, because you want to make changes and you're impatient and all those things. But I do think that every founder has strengths and weaknesses, and seeing your flaws as a consequence of the strengths that you have, and then working out a system to alleviate those flaws. And that can be as easy as having a colleague who's just really good at it, and you just know to outsource to them whenever timing issues or whatever come up, right? Or having some kind of spreadsheet, whatever it is that you need to do. Those are really important tools, and I think spending a little bit of time on that on a regular basis can be very, very powerful in terms of like just improving your own workflow and process. Yeah, I'd recommend that for anyone.
Final question for you. For any other sustainability founder watching at the moment, what's one thing you'd like them to walk away thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to this idea of measuring value. There's a huge opportunity right now to embrace these new tools that are coming out, colloquially called AI, but also work within the systems that you have, but like add that layer of complexity to actually measure total cost, because it's been really difficult to do before and it's getting easier to do with these new systems. And if you can measure total cost, your carbon footprint calculations start mattering in a very different way than a lot of the financial models add to sustainability. And that's, I think, the number one hope that I have right now is like everyone's going to do that. Because if we do that, we know, like we've looked at the numbers, and it is faster, better, and cheaper to send files rather than parts. I mean, we can prove it. It's not like there's no question about that. I can show you the numbers. And it depends a little bit on the parts and so on, but for the vast majority of components now, that's becoming true. But only if you look at it from a total cost perspective, not if you look at it at a point of, I'm going to order 10,000 of this and look at like the cost per part for 10,000 versus a one-off locally produced part. It's always going to be more expensive than if you order 10,000 parts from China. The problem is now you have 10,000 parts from China. So that's the equation, right? And like I think that's true regardless of what sort of product you're working into from a sustainability angle. There's always some aspect of that. Yeah, that's my look into that. Now's the time.
How can people get in touch with you, get in touch with Ivaldi, find you online?
I'm on LinkedIn, so hit me up there is probably the easiest. Otherwise, you can drop me an email at espen@ivaldi.com as well, and I'll maybe answer that. I get a lot of email these days, but LinkedIn's a good place.
Espen, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, likewise, Chris. Thank you so much for your time.